fiercest fighting of the whole war. More than half of Israel's losses came in this single battle, but Uri survived untouched, and the city was taken. The Wailing Wall, the holiest place of the Jews, was once again in Jewish hands. Not only the city of Jerusalem was reunited by the Six-Day War, all of former Palestine, which had been divided between Arabs and Jews by the United Nations in 1948, was now under Israeli control. Israel's borders expanded enormously, and the hostile Arab armies around it were pushed back much farther away from heavily populated areas. But for the Palestinian Arabs, the Six-Day War was a disaster. Many of them, like the thousands who lived in this refugee camp near Jericho, had to flee the country altogether when Israeli troops seized the West Bank. The fate of the Jews in exile becomes the fate of the Palestinians. And for over 1 million Palestinian Arabs who stay behind in the occupied territories, all the future holds is permanent Israeli military rule. Most Palestinian Arabs have learned the same lesson from this miserable experience that the Jewish Zionists learned from their own people's long misery and exile, that without your own state and your own army, there can be no security, no possibility of controlling your own destiny. So a lot of recent Middle Eastern history has been taken up by the desperate attempts of the Palestinians to create their own state and army. It's in the nature of the system to force everybody to play the same game by the same ruthless rules. Not that even the Israelis, who are very good at the game, can win more than a temporary security from their military power. The destruction of 3 hijacked airliners on a disused airfield in Jordan in 1970 was one of the first signs that Palestinians themselves were starting to fight back. But the PLO was still too weak to strike at Israel. It concentrated mostly on easy targets outside Israel's borders, aiming for propaganda gains. The Palestinian guerrillas were still not the main threat to Israel's security. The real danger for Israel remained the regular armies of its Arab neighbors. Uri Eshkoli's second war came 2 years after his first. It was called the War of Attrition. Uri's unit was pinned down by a heavy Egyptian artillery bombardment one day in 1969. A tiny piece of Egyptian shrapnel found its way into his spine. It took 6 hours to get him out to a hospital, and Uri will never walk again.
The human being is so flexible, so sometimes I forgot that I'm a war disabled, and I live my life quite normally. When I start to think over and all those things, it may hurt a little bit, but usually life go on. I go to work, I go to parties, I even dance sometimes, standing on a wall, lying on one of the girls that dance with me. Life goes on.
But the life that goes on is haunted always by the possibility of violence. For the settlements like Kfar Giladi up on the northern frontier, life became far more dangerous in the 70s as PLO guerrillas began to bombard them with Katyusha rockets from southern Lebanon and make raids across the border. The settlements had to turn themselves into fortified camps.
We are suffering from the problem of security, and Kfar Giladi was an open kibbutz like in all the villages all over the world. Today now it's a kind of a fortress. There is the fence all around the kibbutz. If the children want to go outside, they have to take with them one of the members with a gun. Some member who live here that must make guard. And of course the Katyusha attack. For example, the last year in three times, Kfar Gadi was hurt by Katyusha rocket.
At Kfar Giladi, the defenses are obvious, watchtowers and barbed wire. In most of the world, the boundary defenses are less visible, but we all live behind borders. For many of us, the border we defend is far away, and the main threat is from nuclear missiles, not guerrillas on foot. But the price of sovereignty is almost always blood in the end. The blood of other people's children and of your own. A small part of that price was paid on May 3rd, 1974 by another kibbutz just up the hill from Kfar Giladi. That night, 3 PLO gunmen broke into Ms. Gavan's nursery and held its children hostage until morning. One child was killed and 4 were wounded. When Israelis do this to other people's children, they use air raids, not guerrillas, but it's all part of the same thing. Play the game and pay the price. The people of northern Israel simply dig in. It's not a good way to live, but they know no other. Kfar Giladi builds a complex of 50 underground bunkers to survive the rocket attacks of the PLO. Attacks by people who also believe they own this land.
Everything is very normal, very usual, until we have the Katyushas and the bombings and the shells. And we need to hide in the shelters. And then for some days or some period, our normal life is really destroyed. We have only to hide our heads and to lie very quietly to hear if it's coming through, if it's falling far.
In fact, these bunkers haven't been used much recently. For the past 11 months, there's been an effective ceasefire between Israel and the PLO. But the whole northern border area is tense. For years, the Israeli government has been longing to destroy the PLO in southern Lebanon. It's common knowledge that the plans to invade Lebanon are ready, just waiting for the right excuse. On Thursday, June 3rd, 1982, Israel's ambassador in London is gunned down in front of the Dorchester Hotel. The gunman is Palestinian, and the following day Israel seizes the pretext and launches massive air raids on Palestinian camps around Beirut. The PLO retaliates with fierce rocket attacks against the northern settlements, including Kfar Giladi. Finally, Prime Minister Begin and his Defense Minister Ariel Sharon have the excuse they need to invade Lebanon.
The cabinet took the following decision: to instruct the Israel Defense Forces to place all civilian population of the Galilee beyond the range of the terrorists' fire from Lebanon, where their bases and their headquarters are concentrated.
A military spokesman said later that the Israelis were on search and destroy missions against Palestinians who had fired rockets into Israel.
In fact, the operation which the Israelis describe as search and destroy, and which is to penetrate only 40 kilometers into Lebanon, is not that at all. It's a full-scale invasion that isn't going to stop anywhere short of Beirut.
Shortly after noon, bombs and artillery fell throughout southern Lebanon. Cover fire for the invasion launched against the Palestinian guerrillas. Civilians have been packing for days and now crowd the coastal roads fleeing to safer areas. Israeli planes pounded several areas, and the anti-aircraft fire was intense. Palestinian guerrillas brought supplies and reinforcements south before